Another important influence for Darwin's theory is Thomas Malthus, who developed this principle of competition and the concept of the struggle for existence, which was pretty critical for the idea of natural selection. And Malthus was looking specifically at human populations and looking at how fast the population grew as opposed to resources, which had kind of a steady change. And because we would have fewer resources in human population, that created this competition and the struggle for existence. So in 1831, Darwin heads off on the Beagle, his infamous voyage to South America, and he made a lot of observations on this trip, which led him to question the teachings of the church. He noticed some similar yet different species on both the South American islands and the mainland, and also in other places. So, like he noticed the ostrich and the ray were very similar, but didn't necessarily live in the exact same type of environments. So, of course, another big example are the finches on the islands. Were similar to the ones on the mainland, but different. There were, even on the islands themselves, there were different sized beaks and so forth. So he collected a lot of specimens and took them back to England with him. He also noticed that when he was on the South American mainland up in the Andes, that he was finding seashells at 13,000 feet above sea level. So part of what happened on this trip is he actually confirmed Lyell's geologic principles, which of course made Lyell really happy. Excuse me. And so he was able to demonstrate that yes, the processes at work in the past were operating in the present. And so he supported Lyell's principle of uniformitarianism. The similarities he was seeing between various animals helped to promote this continuity of life, which helped to solidify the idea of continuous change, and also helped him develop his idea of common descent or common ancestor. Through this process also, he looked at how geographic isolation could lead to the development of different species. Geographic barriers like mountains and oceans would cause the separation, and then these populations would start to adapt to these environments, to their separate environments. And that is referred to as adaptive radiation. So all of these ideas he kind of mulled over, and when he gets back to England, starts to develop a more cohesive kind of theoretical approach. Now, Ernst Mayr, in a book called One Long Argument, kind of reduces Darwin's theory into 5 basic tenets. And the first one is evolution as such. So species change over time. Darwin refers to this as descent with modification. The one thing he didn't know is exactly how this occurred, because he didn't know about the genetics, and that comes later with a guy by the name of Gregor Mendel. And if you want to know more about this, take some biology, take an evolutionary theory class, take biological anthropology. We'll go into this in a little bit more detail. Another idea is common descent, so the single origin of life, which is really kind of the backbone of the theory. And this provided a unity to the world that wasn't there before. Gradualism. Gradual, continuous accumulation of changes over time. There's some debate about this in modern evolutionary theory, but it was important in Darwin's concept because it provided the time frame for all of these changes to accumulate, which would result then in the multiplicity of species. So through the process of geographic isolation and adaptive radiation, daughter species would go off and eventually become separate, or new species different from their parent species. And all of this happened through the mechanism of natural selection. So let's look at that just a little bit more detail. Natural selection works at the level of the individual in Darwin's approach to evolutionary theory. It's predicated on the availability of variation. A population has to have different traits available for natural selection to work. So it's very much connected to the environment, because trait A might be good in one type of environment, and trait B might not be well in that environment, but be really good in another environment. So if you have A's and B, and let's just call it in the green environment, where A's can really utilize the resources well, then the B population is going to decrease. But let's say there's a change and the environment becomes red, which is what B is really well adapted for. So we might see the B population start to increase because they can exploit the resources better than A as that population starts to decrease. And that's what we refer to as differential reproduction. And that's what determines a species' fitness or an individual's fitness. Can that individual survive to reproduce and have their offspring survive to reproductive age so that they can reproduce also? So natural selection, it is about competition, but not just for resource. It's competition for resources so that you can reproduce. So that is the key. And it's these ideas that Darwin proposes that gets people thinking about how these can be applied to human society. And that's kind of one of the major significances of Darwin's theory to anthropology, is this realization that human culture also evolves. Now in 1860, a guy by the name of Herbert Spencer actually took Darwin's ideas and tried to apply them to human society. Now I don't know if he didn't really understand Darwin's theory totally, but he kind of corrupted it a little bit. He is the guy that coined the term survival of the fittest. It was not Darwin. Spencer proposed that social evolution was driven by competition. So those societies that were better able to compete had the right to basically do whatever they wanted. And this idea was used to justify imperialist doctrine and genocidal practices of both kind of the major imperial powers of the time, which would have been the Great Britain and United States, which were both in expansion mode at the time. But it was also kind of glommed on by the earliest capitalists that were emerging during this time frame. And this idea of social Darwinism and competition is still kind of critical to capitalism today. But that's for another class. Earlier on, before we start talking about Darwin's theory, I mentioned unilineal evolution, and this is one of the first paradigms developed for anthropology. And this simply states that cultural evolution occurred in a simple linear fashion. So we have simple societies, hunting and gathering societies, that go through stages to get to complex societies or industrial nations, because Great Britain and the United States were the models then for these complex societies. So you have three basic levels of human development. Edward Tyler came up with the term savagery being the most basic or the simplest. Then societies moved through barbarism and up to civilization. So savagery was hunting and gathering. Barbarism, simple farming and pastoralism. And then civilization based on literacy. And he assumed that all societies went through this, and all societies' goal was to become civilized. Tyler was in the UK. Morgan was in the United States, and he kind of developed 7 stages of development. So kind of basing it off the same same ideas of Tyler, but just a little bit more detailed. So he talked about the lower, middle, and upper status of savagery, and the lower, middle, and upper status of barbarism and civilization. And he based these on technological advances. So going from simple hunting and gathering to fish subsistence and the controlled use of fire, then to bow and arrow, pottery, animal domestication in the Eastern Hemisphere, and maize and irrigation agriculture in the Western Hemisphere, then the smelting of different kinds of metals, until finally you get to civilization and the alphabet and writing. So again, but they both believe that all societies had this end goal of being a part of civilization as defined by the industrial nations. So there's a couple of problems. It's a very ethnocentric kind of paradigm. And ethnocentrism is simply this view that one's own culture group is superior to all others, and you evaluate every other culture group based on your own culture. So it kind of supports the concept that Western civilization is the pinnacle of evolution, and it was used to justify the colonization of other countries because these industrial nations were just helping others to evolve more rapidly. But it was really simply too simple. It couldn't explain the diversity of all the world's cultures. So enter Franz Boas and the period of culture history. So early to mid 1900s, it's almost anti-theoretical. Boas claimed that lineal speculation was useless, that we needed to really gather huge amounts of data or these historical particularisms, the details of each culture, before we could really start to get into some explanations of culture change and culture evolution.